So in this segment, we'll talk about CDOs or collateralized debt obligations. This is the last part of your reading on asset-backed securities. Now, we've talked about a variety of different asset-backed securities, and perhaps one of the more complex structures is a collateralized debt obligation. So let's just understand briefly what it is. We don't need to get into an immense amount of detail, but as long as you understand the basic points, you'll be able to answer the questions you will get on the exam. So a CDO is an asset-backed security backed by a diversified pool of debt obligations. So what do we mean by debt obligations? Does this mean, are these debt obligations assets for the issuer of a CDO? They are. So, for example, if you have so debt obligations effectively means or essentially means various kinds of fixed income instruments. So what are the sorts of debt obligations that will serve as your collateral for a CDO? Examples include high yield bonds or junk bonds, other structured financial products. So you could have mortgage-backed securities, other kinds of asset-backed securities. You could have emerging market bonds, bank loans, special situation loans, distressed debt. So the whole point here is, if this is your issuer who is issuing these collateralized debt obligations, the pool now is a diversified set of debt instruments such as the items mentioned above. Okay. When we issue CDOs, do you think we can have complex structures with different sorts of bond classes or tranches? We can. The tranches in a CDO typically can be thought of as being in one of three categories. Either you have senior tranches, mezzanine tranches, or subordinate / equity tranches. Of these, where do you think the credit risk is the least? With senior tranches. And who absorbs that risk? The equity or subordinate tranches. The senior and mezzanine tranches are rated, and subordinate equity tranches unrated. What issuers try to do is try to set up their senior tranches so they at least have a A rating. And why are equity tranches not rated? Because effectively they are absorbing a lot of risk and they are almost behaving like equity, so they don't receive a rating. Mezzanine tranches will have a rating, but obviously a lower rating relative to senior tranches. The proceeds to meet the obligations to the CDO tranches, which is interest and principal repayments, come from coupon interest payments of the underlying assets. So if these underlying assets are other bonds, the coupon payments that come in for these assets, any maturing assets in the underlying pools. So what does that mean? So if an underlying asset is maturing and the final payments are coming in, that serves as cash flow, and the sale of assets in an underlying pool. So the manager here who is managing this pool, if he feels that instrument here is overvalued, what can he do? He can simply sell that off and buy another pool. So effectively the job of the manager here is pretty intense. He needs to keep an eye on the market, keep buying and selling, because how do you think the issuer here makes money? Yeah, the issuer makes money. The issuer has made certain commitments to these various tranches. So if the issuer can make more money relative to what has been committed, that's how he makes money. Okay. Now, you need to understand this picture from the curriculum. The curriculum goes into a lot of detail, but we will just focus on the core points. There are lots of different kinds of CDOs or collateralized debt instruments. The first division or bifurcation is between what's called cash CDOs and synthetic CDOs. And the basic difference is that cash CDOs are backed by a pool of cash market debt instruments. This is probably what would come to your mind by default. When we talk about a cash CDO, this effectively means that the underlying instruments, be they junk bonds or other mortgage-backed securities or bank loans, that those, we actually own those assets. Okay, so that's a cash CDO, versus a synthetic CDO is one where we don't actually own those assets, we simply have an economic exposure to those assets. As an example, let's say that you buy a call option on a bond. Okay, you haven't actually bought the bond, you have bought a call option on the bond. What's the economic exposure that you are taking? The exposure is that if the bond price goes up, you benefit. Okay, so without actually buying the bond, you have economic exposure. So as you can imagine, there is extensive use of derivatives and other complex products when we talk about a synthetic CDO. I'll come to this later. Let's continue our focus right now on cash CDOs, which are easier to understand because we actually are buying all the underlying instruments. Now, in the cash CDO side of this graph, of this picture, we have two kinds of cash CDOs, either what's called arbitrage driven or balance sheet driven. I'll describe the arbitrage driven in more detail on the next slide. Here, let's just understand briefly what all these different terms mean. Okay, the motivation for the motivation in an arbitrage transaction is for the sponsor to earn the spread between the yield offered on the debt obligation in the underlying pool and the payment made to the various tranches in the structure. So I'll draw a picture on the next slide to explain exactly what this means, but very simply what a manager is trying to do is earn a higher return on his pool relative to what he pays the holders of the CDO instrument. So that's the motivation behind the arbitrage-driven CDO. A balance sheet-driven CDO. So in a balance sheet-driven transaction, the motivation of the sponsor is to remove debt instruments, primarily loans, from its balance sheet. The curriculum doesn't get into too much detail on this, so as long as you just memorize this term, that one of the motivations for a cash CDO is to remove assets from the balance sheet. And very briefly, people in the banking sector can understand this. In the banking sector, when you have loans on your balance sheet, regulations require you to have a high capital charge against those loans. So if you can actually somehow remove those loans from your balance sheet, then your capital charge goes down. If you didn't quite understand that, don't worry about it. Okay, now within arbitrage driven, we can have cash flow CDOs and market value CDO. And as a word of caution, don't get confused between cash flow CDO and cash CDO. So cash CDO again was simply a CDO where you actually own the underlying instruments. Under cash CDO, based on the motivation, one category is arbitrage driven. Then within arbitrage driven, you can have either cash flow CDOs or market value CDOs. In a cash flow CDO, what you are trying to do is you are making money based on all the interest payments that you are receiving, and you are trying to ensure that all the cash flow / interest / coupon that you are getting, that rate is higher than the rate that you are paying your investors. You are not really trying to make money based on capital gains. So with market value CDO, what you are trying to also do, you are concerned with the total return on your underlying instruments. So in a market value CDO, you might actually buy bonds, junk bonds, that you believe are currently undervalued. Because what your intention is, let's say you have a view that interest rates will go down. So you might buy bonds with high maturities, with the intention of selling them later and realizing a capital gain, because if your view that interest rates going down comes true, then your return on high duration bonds is going to be good. Okay, so the point is, in a market value CDO, you are making a return not just on your coupon payments and interest, you are also making a return based on capital gains. So the term used is, so let's just read what the curriculum says. In a cash flow CDO, the primary source is the interest and maturing principal from underlying assets. So that's this. Market value CDO. So in a market value CDO, the proceeds to meet the obligations depend heavily on the total return generated from the portfolio. Okay, so that's just an articulation of what I have been saying. Okay. Now, some of you have gotten this reasonably well, but for those who are struggling with the basic concept behind the arbitrage CDO, I'll draw a very simplistic example. So let's say that this is the issuer of CDOs, and very simply, let's just say that there is one class or just one tranche, and the commitment made to the holders of this CDO on average is a coupon rate of 8.5%. Now, in an arbitrage CDO, there is going to be a pool of debt instruments, and if the manager can somehow create this pool so that after any costs and potential defaults and so on, if he can on average earn 9% on this pool, then how much does he pocket? The 0.5% is what he pockets, and this is a very simplistic example of a arbitrage CDO. Okay, now a slightly more complex structure, and one that you might see in the context of a cash CDO arbitrage transaction, is as follows. So we talked about the fact that typically there are three tranches, a senior tranche, mezzanine, and subordinate or equity tranche. Okay. Now, in this particular case, the holders of the senior tranche are getting LIBOR plus 70 basis points. The mezzanine tranche is getting the 10-year treasury rate plus 200 basis points. So notice that the spread is higher. Why do you think the spread is higher? The risk is more. And then with a subordinate / equity tranche, there is nothing committed. Why? Yeah, this is residual interest. This is like saying, okay, if whatever profit, you can think of these guys as the owners. So whatever benefit comes out goes to this entity. The key as to whether or not it is economic to create an arbitrage transaction is whether or not a structure can offer a competitive return to the subordinated equity tranche. Okay, so investment banks that have made a lot of money on this essentially would issue the structure if they can make money based on this instrument. You can imagine that institutional investors, pension funds, etc. would prefer the safety of some form of some committed payments, whereas people who want to make a ton of money will try and make money out of the equity tranche. Okay. Some other general knowledge related to CDOs. The three relevant periods in a CDO are the ramp-up period, the reinvestment period or revolving period, and the final period where the portfolio assets are sold and debt holders are paid off. So you simply need to remember this. What's the ramp-up period? This is where all the underlying instruments are being purchased. Okay, obviously these underlying instruments are non-trivial, so it's not like just you can buy all this in half a day. You have these junk bonds and various other structured instruments that you are creating. So you can think of this as effectively a complex portfolio of various kinds of debt instruments. So the amount of time that it takes to create that portfolio is called the ramp-up period. Now, all these instruments that you have will typically have an income component. So the period where the income coming in is reinvested is simplistically and appropriately referred to as the reinvestment period or revolving period. Revolving period because sometimes you might retire some instrument that you believe is overvalued and reinvest in maybe undervalued securities. And the final period where the portfolio assets are sold and the debt holders are paid off. Okay, so from a multiple choice perspective, you could easily see a question out of this material. Now, the final point with regard to cash CDOs, credit rating companies that might want to, that are giving a rating to various tranches will do several tests. And what do you think they are most concerned with? They would be concerned with the quality of the underlying collateral. If the quality of the underlying collateral is good, then the associated tranches will get a high rating, and obviously if the quality is weak, then there is a poor rating. The curriculum doesn't say too much on this, so I think as long as you know the basic point here, you are fine. So the tests that are done, or the sorts of tests that are imposed, are either minimum asset diversity score. What do you think this means? Yeah, how diversified? So the more diverse, maybe the better the diversity score. Okay, a minimum weighted average rating, maturity restrictions, coverage tests. I really don't think you need to get into details of this because the curriculum doesn't provide much details. So as long as you know that various tests are performed to figure out the quality of the underlying collateral, you are fine. Okay. Now the last part, do you remember what was the high-level distinction between different kinds of CDOs? One was a cash CDO and the other was a synthetic CDO. In a synthetic CDO, we take an economic risk, but we don't actually own the underlying instruments. Farhan, how can we take the economic risk or economic exposure without ownership? Through derivatives. Okay, from your level 1, what's a simple example of where you can have an exposure to an instrument going up without owning the instrument, without owning it? The simple idea is a call option. Now here we don't necessarily use call options, but the idea is we can use derivatives to get economic exposure without taking legal ownership. Okay, we instead use this exciting instrument, which which is used a lot around the world, and there are people who love these things and there are people who hate them, but they are called CDSs, or credit default swaps. Okay, I am going to explain them very briefly right now, and then we'll see these in detail, or slightly more detail in derivatives, and then in a lot more detail in level 3. But in its simplest form, a credit default swap is like an insurance policy on a loan. So if, for example, I have a loan, what's my worry? That there will be a default. So what I can do is I can buy an insurance, and this insurance is effectively a credit default swap, where if the counterparty defaults, then the CDS pays. Okay, so now when does the CDS become more valuable? If the probability of default goes up, or the underlying credit weakens, the counterparty's credit weakens, what happens to the value of my CDS? Goes up. Now, in this world of financial engineering, what a lot of people do is simply buy the CDS without buying the loan. Okay, so if I bought a CDS without buying the loan, then what am I rooting for? For the loan to go bad, because if the loan goes bad, then my CDS is worth something. So you can just see in that structure that it can open up potential issues, but we won't go there. Right now you've just understood in its simplistic form what a CDS is. So now I'll get back very briefly into how it's used, but at least you've understood the definition. Okay, so on the next slide I'll come back to this. With a synthetic CDO, typically the CDOs are divided into a senior section and a junior section. So these are the two tranches, senior tranche, junior tranche. Obviously, senior tranche are taking less risk. Junior tranche holders have more risk. Okay, junior bondholders in a synthetic CDO have similar risk return position as the junior bondholders in a CDO, in a cash CDO. Okay, what are the advantages to a synthetic structuring? The senior section doesn't require funding. What do you think this means, Nadir? The idea is this. Do you recall in a cash CDO, what was I talked about 3 phases. What was the first phase? The ramp up. So what happens in ramp up? Yeah, so in the ramp up, I'm buying all this. To buying all this, I need funding, right? I need a lot of money to buy these instruments. In a synthetic CDO, do I need as much funding? No. So just the simplistic example is when you buy a stock, you need to pay for the whole stock. but you can also alternatively get the same exposure by buying a call option at a much lower price. Okay, so one advantage of a synthetic CDO is you can get the exposure at a lower price. So the ramp up period is shorter, and it is generally cheaper to acquire the necessary exposure. So from an exam perspective, without going into much details, if you learn the material on this slide, you are 70% of the way there. Okay. The next 25% is contained on this slide, and then 5% we'll have to leave to chance. All right, to get to that 5%, we need to spend a whole day worth of talking, which would not be a good return on investment. Okay, so so this is the segment from the summary in the curriculum. So some of it will be a repeat. In a synthetic CDO, a credit derivative instrument is used to allow the CDO issuer to transfer the economic risk but not the legal ownership of a reference asset. So all we are saying here is we need to use a derivative. The next bullet explains what the derivative is. In a synthetic CDO, the credit derivative used is a CDS, and the instrument allows the protection buyer, who is the asset manager in a synthetic CDO, to protect against default risk on a reference asset. The protection sellers are the tranches in a junior section of the CDO. Okay, so very simplistically, we have two kinds of tranches in a synthetic CDO. You can call the senior and the junior. So what happens in this is the junior sells a credit default swap to the senior. Now notice, when the senior buys the CDS, he is paying a premium, because anytime you buy insurance, you pay a premium. By buying these CDSs, isn't the senior reducing his risk of the default associated with any underlying instruments? So he is reducing his risk, but then his return is coming down because of the premium that he is paying for this insurance. Okay. Whereas what's happening with the junior tranche? So the junior guy is taking on the risk, because if the underlying instrument defaults, who pays? The junior who is selling the CDS. But then what if the underlying instrument does not fail? Then the premium that he is getting is just extra return. So very simplistically, as long as you know this, that's all you need to know. In a synthetic CDO, the return to the junior holder is based on the return from a portfolio of high quality debt instruments, plus the premium received in a credit default swap, which I just talked about, reduced by payments that must be made as a result of a credit event. So what's the junior tranche praying for? Yeah, so if there are no defaults, then A, he gets a high return from the underlying instruments, and B, what's the icing on the cake? The premium on the CDS. There are synthetic balance sheet CDOs and synthetic arbitrage CDO transactions. So just as with cash CDOs, there can also be two motivations for creating a synthetic CDO. What are the two motivations? No. So again, remember, so just like you had a cash CDO with two motivations, similarly with a synthetic CDO, you can have two motivations. One is arbitrage and the other is balance sheet. What's the motivation with balance sheet? It is to reduce your exposure to loans or other debt instruments. What's the motivation with arbitrage? Yeah, the motivation with arbitrage is to earn a spread between what you get on your underlying instruments and what you need to pay the tranche holders. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this long reading on asset-backed securities. Practice the problems in the curriculum.